I'm going to be telling you the most important things you need to know about coal. Coal is the number 2 resource in the world, number 3 in the United States. It used to be much more prominent in the United States. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But it is still a major resource for energy use globally and one that is still growing. We mostly use coal for electricity generation. That's its main use. You can see here both showing it for the world and in the United States. That's the main use for coal. It is also used in some other key industries. Iron and steel comes up oftentimes when we're talking about coal. Other things in the petrochemical industry, concrete, for example, non-metallic minerals. So coal is utilized a lot in industrial processes as well. And when you hear talk about some of these hard to decarbonize industries, a lot of time that is because of the coal use in these industries like iron and steel. Our main use for coal, though, is electricity production. And this is just to give you a sense of what that whole energy system looks like. Starting with coal going into our system. So we have to find and mine the coal, make electricity in our heat engine, which is our power station, where we're burning the coal to produce electricity, and then using that electricity for all of our end uses. It's a highly inefficient system. Of the 100 units of energy we're putting in, we're only getting 1 to 10 units of energy service out. Much of that energy loss is at the power station. Our coal-fired power plants tend to be around 30 to 40% efficient at converting that coal into electricity. So 2/3 of your energy is lost right there at the power plant. It is the number 1 energy resource for electricity production in the world, and that use is growing. So here I'm showing you kind of the snapshot of what it looks like today, where coal dominates for electricity production, and that coal demand has grown over time and continues to grow. We see growth in natural gas as well. And of course, we see this exponential growth in renewables for electricity demand. So our fastest growing resources are things like solar, but from a much lower point. So coal is still what dominates our electricity production in the world. Much of that coal consumption is taking place in China. During the 2002 to 2012 timeframe, there was a lot of growth in China's economy and demand for energy, and a lot of growth in coal-fired power plants to produce the electricity that was part of that demand and that economic growth. So you can see China really dominates the world in terms of coal consumption, followed by India, where there's also a lot of growth going on in coal consumption. Places like the United States and Europe, where we're seeing a decline in coal demand. So drilling down on what the United States looks like, coal demand in the United States has been declining since about 2007. It used to be half of our electricity generation. Now it's only about 15% of our electricity generation. And you can see renewables have actually passed up coal on our electricity generation system in the United States. So it has really been wind, solar, and natural gas that have taken place of coal on our electricity system. Much of that is because of market factors. Natural gas, wind, and solar have, for a decade and a half, been the cheapest sources of new electricity generation on the grid, even unsubsidized. So those low market prices have really driven out even existing coal. In other words, you could have a new natural gas or new solar farm that would be cheaper to install and operate than continuing to run an existing coal-fired power plant. We have no shortage of coal in terms of the resource in the world. So the world has tons of coal, pun intended, lots of reserves. And I like to say we haven't even had to look that hard for coal. So reserves, when we're talking about reserves and production, the reserves are what is technologically, economically feasible to extract. You can see the big countries that have a lot of coal is the United States, Russia, China, Australia. India also has a lot of coal. So there's no danger of running out of coal, even with the high production that we're at right now. A lot of coal being produced in China and India, especially to meet their domestic demand. The way we form coal, the source of coal is from swampy biomass. So this is like swampy, peaty, woody, planty material that dies and gets smothered inside a swamp. And of course, layers of sand and silt accumulate on top of that swampy biomass. And with time, temperature, and pressure, over hundreds of millions of years, that biomass, that peaty material gets squished into coal that we're using today. And so it's 20 meters of that plant material eventually creates 1 meter thick of coal. So you can imagine the energy density, taking all of that biomass and squishing it down into this coal seam that gives us that high energy density fossil fuel. Coal has different ranks, and those ranks, this is just like the quality of the coal or like how good the coal is. It has to do with its energy content. And if you think about it, it's kind of like how much was it squeezed down? How much was it actually squished into that seam? Peat, which is a resource that is used in some areas, is almost like a pre-coal. It hasn't even been squished into coal. So peat is kind of like the biomassy stuff before it gets squished into coal. Lignite is a low energy content coal, all the way up to anthracite. Anthracite is a very high energy dense coal. Most of the lower quality, lower energy content coals are used in our electricity system because you're just burning them for heat to create steam in our thermal power plants. Anthracite is more valuable, and so it is used as a high heating coal for industrial processes primarily. The way we get the coal, there's kind of two ways we get it out of the ground, out of these seams. There's surface mining and underground mining. Surface mining is what dominates in the United States. Much of that is coming from places like the Powder River Basin and Wyoming. So in surface mining, we're basically just taking all the plants off the surface. We're usually blasting the surface material, rock material, and removing all of that to expose the coal seam. Then we can just dig the coal seam out with these big machines like behind me called a drag line to dig that coal out, put it in dump trucks, and then you can take it to the trains to transport it to the coal-fired power plants. Surface mining is very land intensive, but you also have a very high recovery rate for the coal that you're getting out of there. And it tends to be a lot safer for the miners than underground mining. Underground mining still dominates in the world. It is getting a lot more mechanized in a lot of places. There's a lot more machinery and less miners being used, but it's still a much more dangerous way of getting coal out. And the recovery rate tends to be much lower. Often you're using the coal to kind of keep the ceiling from collapsing in. So you leave some of the coal in place in order to be able to extract the rest of the coal. So the recovery is lower and the safety is worse in underground mining. I want to give you a sense of scale of what this open pit mining looks like. So this is what a typical dump truck would look like at an open mining coal mine. So you can see the people next to the wheel on the dump truck. These dump trucks are very large, and that's the same dump trucks we're seeing here in this picture. So this would be that same dump truck, just to give you a sense of scale of how large scale these open pit mines really are for exposing these coal seams. One of the areas that's been growing a lot as demand has grown in places like China and India is international coal trade. For a long time, coal wasn't traded a whole lot, unlike oil, but that coal trade has really grown with the growth in demand in places like China. And so you can see our major exporters of coal are Indonesia and Australia. Major importers of coal are going to be those places that are still using a lot of coal, like China and India, where it's growing. Japan has been a major importer of a lot of fossil fuels. And then use is declining in Europe, but it is still importing coal for some of its use. Now let's talk about the environmental impacts of coal. This is a really busy slide to give you a sense that coal, as I talked about, is our most carbon intensive fuel, and it's our dirtiest fossil fuel. And those are two different things. Carbon intensive, meaning greenhouse gas emissions when you burn it. Dirtiest, meaning the air pollution, the other impacts, the solid waste. Those kind of things are all worst in terms of its comparison to natural gas and oil as our other fossil fuels. So there are impacts on the upstream side. We saw land disturbance and things like that, water use, water pollution, abandoned mines and having to take care of that. A lot of the coal seams have heavy metals in them. Coal has heavy metals in it. It's that whole swamp squished together into a rock. And so it has things like mercury and lead and selenium and heavy metals that we really worry about in terms of getting into our ecosystem or how it impacts human health. So exposed mines are a problem because that can get into the waterway as with rain and other things, both surface mines and underground mines. And it can be a problem on the downstream because when you burn that coal in the coal-fired power plant, everything that doesn't burn is left over as a solid waste. And that's something called coal ash or coal combustion residuals. And that stuff contains all of those metals, radioactive material, lead, mercury, selenium, those kind of things. And then, of course, there's the air pollution. Coal often has a lot of sulfur. So if that sulfur is not removed as you're burning the coal, you can have impacts like acid rain, which we've seen in the past, but there's a lot of regulations removing sulfur or things like mercury from the coal exhaust that can really reduce those impacts. So we were just talking about greenhouse gas emissions. Coal is 40% of the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. It's over 40%. Remember, energy is about 3/4 of the whole problem. So coal is the part of the energy sector that's contributing most to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And it's not just from the burning of the coal. You actually can find methane in your coal seams. And so when you're mining that coal, oftentimes you're releasing that methane to the atmosphere. And methane is a greenhouse gas that's over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So that can have a major impact on climate change as a greenhouse gas. And then the coal ash after you've burned it. So after you've burned your coal and you've produced your electricity, you have this coal ash left over. For a long time here in the United States, we didn't have any regulations on this coal ash, despite it being a toxic waste. So it's been stored in big ponds. A lot of those were unlined ponds. We worry about it getting into our water system. And so this is kind of a dramatic picture of what a trout looks like with selenium contamination from selenium that came from coal ash that got into a waterway. We have a lot of coal ash because for every 7 tons of coal that we burn, we get a ton of coal ash. And so over the decades that we've been using coal, we have a lot of coal ash and not a lot of regulation on disposal. There's not a lot of ways to use it as a resource in terms of a waste stream. I list in this chart, there are some options of using it to harden concrete, structural fills, things like that. You do have to have something that locks it away because it has all of these heavy metals that you don't want exposed to the water, the atmosphere, to humans. Finally, something you might hear about a lot is clean coal. So I just want to give you a sense of what that means. Clean coal, and the way the industry has defined it and talked about it, really means using coal with carbon capture and storage. If you use a coal-fired power plants with carbon capture and storage, you can eliminate the carbon dioxide emissions that are coming from your coal-fired power plant. That does not have any impact on the other challenges with coal and those impacts. So the methane emissions from mining, the coal ash that we just talked about, the land use, all of those things are still impacts. So when we're talking about clean coal and what the industry means, it's really just reducing the carbon emissions from coal, not the other impacts that we've talked about. Finally, what does the future of coal look like? It's been growing. There's some predictions that it'll continue to grow, especially places in China and India. There's an effort from the current United States administration to have it grow again here in the United States. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty of the future of coal. So here I've really just put that a lot of our coal use really depends on how committed we are to our climate policies. And that will really determine what the future of coal looks like. All right, that's kind of your 10-minute take on coal. If you want to know more, you can watch the full lecture on our website. If you just want to know more about energy topics, please join our newsletter.